the most important part, and probably something that is, the foundation of any properly thought out succession plan, is to have all of the different stakeholders, whether they are partners who are either in the next couple of years, or maybe there's no timeline set yet, but people who will be retiring out of the equity partner ranks, and then a discussion with the people who will be coming into those leadership roles. And it doesn't have to necessarily, I don't want to spend the entire focus is on equity partners, non-equity partners, becoming equity partners. Oftentimes, especially at some of the larger, mid-sized and larger law firms, there are different people who are running the accounting and billing departments. There's people who are running the marketing end of the firm. Those people also need to kind of be included in a succession planning discussion. But I think the foundation of any good succession plan is to making sure that the people who are going to be departing at some point, and the people who are going to be taking over those responsibilities, are all on the same page as to sort of what's expected of them.
Welcome to On Record PR, where we go on record with industry leaders to discuss best practices for public relations strategies that drive business success. Let's get started with the show.
Welcome to On Record PR. I'm the executive producer and guest host, Jennifer Simpson Carr. Today, I'm going on record with Patrick Cusick, Director of Law Firm Services at Armanino LLP. With more than 15 years of experience working in finance and administration within law firms, he now enjoys working exclusively with law firms offering outsourced accounting and financial solutions and consulting on a variety of strategic initiatives, including succession planning. Patrick, welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me. I'm very excited to be here.
I'm excited to be here. And as we were chatting, preparing for this, I think I expressed my excitement around the topic of succession planning, because we're seeing a shift in the market right now where it is really very important and something that law firms should be focusing on.
That's entirely true. It's definitely becoming an area that's been coming into sharper focus as some firms, unfortunately, have started to falter when they don't have succession plans in place, or maybe think they have a succession plan in place. So it's becoming something that has always been important, but as of late, I think it's becoming a little bit of sharper focus in the legal industry.
I completely agree with that. It has always been important, but when we see it hit the headlines, we know that there should be a focus on it. I know over the last couple of years, we've seen some headlines in the news, such as law firms are struggling to implement succession plans. The lawyer mindset is at odds with succession planning best practices, which makes complete sense because client demands are urgent for lawyers. The billable hours are urgent for lawyers, and they're really focused on offering solutions. I also think another piece of this that you might agree with is that there's generally probably a sense too in leadership that they're going to be there for a while. Nothing will happen to me, or I'll always be available for my clients. And unfortunately, we've seen that that's, not always the case. And in a few instances, we've seen firms actually dissolve, largely due to a lack of proper succession planning. So you touched on this, and I want to ask you more about this. We're both in situations where we're consistently having conversations with practice leaders, managing partners, office heads. And when we bring up succession planning, the general response is that, oh, we have one, or we've tackled succession planning. But when you and I dig down deep into that conversation with them, we find that it's not exactly the succession planning that you and I are talking about today.
That's very true. In fact, when lawyers renew their license in Pennsylvania, there's a section as they're kind of going through updating their address, the firm they're affiliated with. There's a section about succession planning in there. And I think for a lot of lawyers, the concept is that if they're at a large firm, maybe they don't even need to quote unquote succession plan because they already have other attorneys available to pick up their legal cases in the event that they do, retire or something else happens. But that's, I guess the legal definition when it comes to lawyers, succession planning, and maybe what you and I would consider to be more of the business side of succession planning are kind of a little bit, they're not the same thing. And I think that might be where some lawyers are getting tripped up, thinking that they have, people in place, whether they're younger associates or other partners that take over the workload, or maybe they've already introduced some other attorneys to their clients, and they maybe they see the path of how things are going to go. But unless you actually sit down and have all the stakeholders be on the same page and talk about the financial implications for everybody if and when a partner starts to retire or, God forbid, dies or leaves suddenly. When these things happen, it's not just a matter of your clients and the cases and not missing deadlines and having that seamless representation, which is, of course, ethically very important for attorneys. But really, a big part of it is law firms are businesses. Like any business, the CEO or the vice president of sales or whoever it is, might leave at some point, and you need to be really serious about who's going to step up into those roles. And we're talking about a law firm, which, has the partnership aspect of it. When law firms are owned by attorneys and one attorney who's an equity partner leaving or a shareholder leaving, oftentimes means that someone else has to step up into that role when they retire. And there's financial implications for the individual who is sort of rising to that equity partner level. It becomes almost a discussion. It's almost a financial transaction at that point, and should kind of be treated with that same seriousness that, that attorneys treat other matters. So yes, to your point, a lot of attorneys maybe kind of think about succession planning in kind of that legal, ethical sense, and not so much about really the hardcore kind of business, hard accounting and finance, and what this really means to the viability of the business, the viability of the law firm.
I love how you put that. And that's exactly so well said. Certainly the legal and ethical implications are something that's top of mind. But this, as you said, has financial implications and is a much more ongoing process than what we sometimes hear about, which is simply a larger discussion, maybe at a partner meeting or an executive committee meeting about what does the future of certain clients look like. So let's dive into that piece. So what are some of the important parts of a succession plan?
I think the most important part, and probably something that is the foundation of any properly thought out succession plan, is to have all of the different stakeholders, whether they are partners who are either in the next couple of years, or maybe there's no timeline set yet, but people who will be retiring out of the equity partner ranks, and then a discussion with the people who will be coming into those leadership roles. And it doesn't have to necessarily, I don't want to spend think the entire focus is on equity partners, non-equity partners, becoming equity partners. Oftentimes, especially at some of the larger, mid-sized and larger law firms, there are different people who are running the accounting and billing departments. There's people who are running the marketing end of the firm. Those people also need to kind of be included in a succession planning discussion. But I think the foundation of any good succession plan is to making sure that the people who are going to be departing at some point and the people who are going to be taking over those responsibilities are all on the same page as to sort of what's expected of them. As you mentioned, or you're talking earlier, sort of, talk about these things at a partnership meeting. That's maybe where the discussion should start. But I think it's unfortunately sometimes a naive assumption that a partner is going at an equity partner meeting is going to talk about succession planning and just kind of assume that, the younger partner or the younger associate who they kind of have their eye on to take over the work is on the same page with them. They might very well may not be. And unfortunately, that's where that's where sometimes succession plans can falter or run into trouble when not everyone's on the same page. So I think the first step is making sure that people who are going to either be leaving the firm and departing and people who are going to be taking over the firm are really have an honest discussion, oftentimes facilitated by a third party, as to what that means for everyone involved and making sure that everyone's on the same page and that expectations are very clearly defined.
And I love that. I love that response. And something that you said really struck me. You said, I think lawyers may think, oh, I'm at this size firm, so I may not need to be thinking about. And what we are finding is that succession planning is firm size agnostic. It does not matter the size of your firm. There is an important role succession planning plays, whether it is firm-wide, practice-wide, key client initiatives. So this is something that should be on really everyone's mind, particularly as some of our generations are starting to phase out.
You said, generationally. I think, too, it's important for law firms to consider that they might have had a structure in place that allowed partners to retire and new partners to become equitized and become, shareholders in the firm. And that might have worked for, 30 or 40 years in the case of some of the, older firms. But as, times are changing, expectations among younger attorneys are different than they were 10, 15, 20 years ago. So sometimes when a succession plan is in place and has been working, that doesn't necessarily mean that it's going to continue to work as the legal landscapes change and winds shift, and younger attorneys kind of expect different things and maybe aren't willing to sort of, quote, buy into the firm and mortgage their house. They might be looking for other avenues to end up in those equity ranks. And that's, again, something where, just having those honest conversations and setting expectations.
So, Patrick, tell me a little bit more about how you and your team approach succession planning.
What we do when we are encountering a firm that has, either hired us or has begun talking to us about how do we, handle the succession planning issue. Again, as I mentioned, the first thing we do is really kind of level set with the stakeholders. We'll typically first talk to the current equity partners. We'll find out from either them, meaning multiple partners, or in some cases, it's one partner. I can tell you without divulging names, there's an ongoing succession planning project that I'm working on for a law firm in California. It is one equity partner. He has started the firm 15, 20 years ago. He'll tell you that he, really sort of, quit a job at a larger corporate firm, wanted to start his own thing, right? And he did that a long time ago. And, what he put into the business many, many years ago was peanuts. He just really worked out of his house, bootstrapped it, built the firm up. And now it's one of the premier law firms in his industry in Northern California. He's hugely successful. He's making a lot of money. He's doing very well. And he proactively, which is not always the case, is proactively looking to, do these succession planning, this work to put this plan in place. The first thing we talked to him is really kind of get down to the nuts and bolts and really what's on his mind, which was compensation. How much are you making now? What do you expect to make when you, and if you leave the firm, what's your quote unquote payout for this firm that you built, which has value. I mean, he's built something. And if this wasn't a law firm, this was a widget making company, he could go out and sell that to another widget making company or to a private equity firm. There's some value in the firm. With law firms, because it can only be owned by lawyers, it's a little bit harder to drill down on the value. But we said to him, what are your financial expectations here? And he was very, very plain with us about how much he makes now. He gave us all the financials. And he was very, very plain about what he sort of expects to get paid out. He built this firm and he expects to retire, and he wants the firm to continue. And he has a great love and affinity for not just the attorneys, but all the staff and everyone that works at this firm. And he wants the firm to continue. And then we asked him, all right, so we understand sort of what you're expecting to happen in the future when you kind of set that deadline and when you're going to retire. Who do you think should take this firm over? And after going, multiple meetings and discussions, we've settled on sort of a two-part phase. One is that he has a couple of younger people at the firm that he thinks have the skill set to take the firm over. He also identified a smaller firm that he's going to absorb and potentially add these other two people to the mix to give him a larger pool of people to draw from, and then build almost, he's going to retire and he's going to build about a 3 or 4 person, maybe even 5 or 6 person equity pool of partners to take the firm over. So the process is really just aligning the people, figuring out what they're looking for financially, what their careers. We interviewed these other individuals who the main partner, the main equity partner, had identified. This one person in particular, I think he or she has what it takes to help lead this firm. But we'd like to meet with them and talk to them to find out if we kind of agree with that assessment. As an outside observer, we can come along and say, you might think this person's fantastic, but I don't think they really have what it takes to run the firm, or they would be phenomenal. And here's where the skill set lies, and here's the future responsibilities they should take on as this firm grows in the future and as you kind of phase off into retirement. So we really just talk a lot to the people, talk a lot about the processes internally and who can take over what aspect of the firm. And then again, as I mentioned earlier, it's a little bit of a transaction. So we really start to talk about what are people making, no one wants to go from a senior partner to equity partner, junior partner to equity partner, whatever it is. No one wants to kind of make that next step in their legal ladder and make less money. Mm-hmm. So we talked a lot about what are people making now? What's the compensation structure? How do we have to change the structure? And then lastly, we spend a long time and a lot of effort mapping all that out and modeling all that out. We want to make sure that if the partner who is retiring expects to, get paid, I'm just going to make some numbers up here, but $250,000 a year for 5 years, because he thinks that's somehow what he or she deserves, can the firm afford to do that? And if the new equity partners or the new people stepping into leadership roles, if they're expecting a bump in their salary, what kind of bump are they expecting? What are those numbers? And again, can the firm afford that? And what kind of assumptions do we have to make to get the model to work? And how can we make sure that people aren't getting what they think they deserve? We can show them with some, pretty black and white numbers that this is the financial position of the firm. These are the growth expectations and assumptions we're making. And here's the equity piece left over to be split up, or here's how the salary numbers are going to break down, so that people can say, okay, I kind of thought I'm making a lot more than that, but I'm very comfortable with that number. And I can also see that, we call it the promised land. They can see that as they move into that ownership level and the firm grows, they can see that they're going to get, more of the profits. They can see that, they're able to make more money, or they're able to be in a better financial situation with this plan and this model we put in front of them. So a lot of it is really getting into the numbers, getting into the weeds, and making sure that what people think that they would like, what they expect, that the firm can actually afford to make those things happen.
You've touched on a couple of things that are really interesting. First is that you've condensed what is a pretty intensive project or process here.
It is, yes.
So that alone should motivate people to start thinking if they haven't already. But also, if firms already have a succession plan, you've touched on the fact that it's an iterative process. And so what the market might have been when an original succession plan was established and agreed upon may be impacted year over year by changes, as you mentioned, in the firms, in the market. Mergers and acquisitions are becoming or will become more prevalent in the next, probably 18 months. So that's all fantastic feedback and all things that our listeners should be thinking about as they're trying to determine ways to maybe have conversations internally with key stakeholders around where their firms are in the process.
And I would just like to point out, and you said this wonderfully a minute ago, I'm talking a lot about succession planning, which is, firm A wants to remain firm A, and the current leadership is going to retire and the new generation is going to take over. And that's definitely a long process. I kind of slowed it down. It's definitely a complicated issue. That's really, when you think about it, that's only kind of one facet. The other one is, you mentioned, it's mergers and acquisitions. And there are firms we've spoken to and really, again, had this discussion and really talked to them about what they're looking for and what the firm is, the future, the direction, the finances. And oftentimes the discussion then turns to, I think maybe you might want to talk about another firm that is in a similar practice area and potentially merging your firm into their firm. That might make more sense for you. It might make more sense for your staff and for the other trainees working for you. It might just be a better fit for everyone. And there's a lot of firms out there that are very happy to get the phone call to say, hey, we've identified a firm that is in a complementary or, same practice areas that you're in. And wouldn't it be great if we could kind of merge these cultures and these firms together? And that oftentimes ends up being a de facto succession plan, which is merging into a larger firm that maybe has some of that in place already.
And a theme that is emerging here in our conversation is transparency and communication. I guess that's two themes, but it's really those transparent conversations and having them with you sounds like it gives firms who may come to you and say, we'd really like to focus on succession planning. They may have something in mind and then speak with you and have many other options presented to them that could best benefit themselves as they think about the future, their partnerships, future partners. I share that because that's really interesting to think that you may go in with one vision of what this could look like and then, identify other ways that could even be more successful.
There are oftentimes many meetings in between that first meeting and that last meeting with the current, managing partner or partners where that financial model I mentioned gets done and redone multiple times because we're, again, coming to them with sort of options. If you do this, you can afford to do this. But if you don't want to do this, then you can't afford to do this other thing. So there's many, many discussions, even just on the financial model where we're constantly going back, revising it, making different assumptions, or just talking to them about, if they're not comfortable with option A, here's option B. Give us, let us come back and model that for you and see how that looks and feels. And if it's sort of what you're looking for, what you're talking about.
That's great. It's great perspective. And it does support the fact that having, kind of that, not outside, but outside perspective, someone looking in with a fresh set of eyes and kind of ideas is always beneficial to the process. Whether or not you go with those directions, it at least allows you to explore different opportunities.
And when we hang up that phone, we don't have to go back and prep for a deposition or have a client meeting. Like when we hang up the phone or hang up that Zoom call, we immediately start working on their succession plan. So that is something that a lot of lawyers, everyone's stressed for time nowadays, but especially at law firms, it's such a time crunch. There's hours to be billed, there's work to be done. And sometimes you have that great discussion, but no one actually internally, the firm has the time to go back and do the work.
And let's pause here to hear a message from our sponsor.
This episode is brought to you by Furia Rubel Communications. Recognized as the #1 agency by the National Law Journal, Furia Rubel helps top businesses and law firms with high-stakes public relations and marketing, reputation management, crisis planning, and incident response, including high-profile litigation media relations. To learn more, go to furiarubel.com or email podcast@furiarubel.com.
So you mentioned, or you shared a great story about the client that you're working with in California with a solo equity partner thinking about the future of the firm. Can we talk a little bit about what role a partnership agreement plays in succession planning?
We can talk about that. And I will first tell you that I unfortunately have met a couple of different firms and they either don't have a partnership agreement in place or they have a very sort of boilerplate, inadequate. It's always shocking, especially with dealing with lawyers, that sometimes a comprehensive, well thought out partnership agreement isn't necessarily always in play. And that actually becomes part of the succession plan. Is if we're going to put all this into place, you need to kind of you need to put this all in writing in a partnership agreement. So a partnership agreement is typically one of the first pieces of documentation we're going to ask for with a law firm to find out what exactly the parameters and the guidelines are now. And again, that's where we sometimes find out that there's maybe not one or there's not a very good one. But yeah, a partnership agreement is a hugely important thing that needs to oftentimes be, it's almost like it's like anyone that has, a will or has, legal documentation that every once in a while it's important to go back and revisit that and make sure that it still makes sense and that things are still, the future that you anticipated or envisioned many, many years ago when you drafted it is still, what you're kind of the shared vision and goal of the firm right now.
That's great. And what other projects do you work on that are related to succession planning?
We work on a couple different projects. The one that is sometimes intrinsically linked to succession planning is what we've been calling a path to partner project. So there are firms that are maybe not ready to talk about succession planning or maybe do have something in mind or something in place or have at least a framework and it's not as much of a pressing issue. But I'm seeing a lot of, I will call it sort of upward pressure from younger associates and more junior partners who are maybe not as content to kind of wait to get the tap on the shoulder to be told, hey, you've made it. Let's invite you to the big conference room and now you're part of the equity gang. It's, them going to some partners or some people and saying, hey, I've been here for a little while. I've developed this book of business. I've done this. I've done that. I've led these initiatives. I'd like a seat at the table. I'd like a piece of the pie. I'd like to be a decision maker. I'd like to have a say in where this firm is going. Oftentimes, this can sound a little corny, Jennifer, but oftentimes come from a place of love. A lot of younger associates or partners that have been at a firm for a couple of years love the firm. They love the culture. They love the people. But they just feel like they don't have any say in the direction. And they get to that point in their career. And like I said, that's that upward pressure where they're saying, I want a seat at the table. So I'm noticing that a lot in law firms. I'll say younger, but attorneys that are not the equity partners are actually maybe the ones starting that conversation, which isn't always the way it used to be.
It's very true. And we've seen the same thing from our perspective. A lot of times I think attorneys will wait on the leadership or historically have waited on the leadership to determine kind of the direction of the firm. And what we've seen over the last several years is more junior attorneys, exactly what you're saying. I really like the firm. I see a future here. I want to be part of that. And that directive or that pressure is coming from different parts of the firm now, which is great because regardless of how the process starts, it's an important one. And it's one that does take time to get right and to make sure it makes sense. And that, everyone we know needs to be on somewhat of a similar page. And that always takes time, particularly at law firms. And one thing that, we're really focusing on right now is the perspective of the firms and the individuals within the firms. But what I'd like to do is talk a little bit about the client's perspective and why this is so valuable for law firms as a client retention tool and a client development tool. And certainly what we're seeing and what we're hearing from general counsel is that they want the next generation of leadership on their client accounts to be an integral and integrated part of the client teams for a long period of time. They are not interested in meeting kind of the next leader of their law firm team 6 to 12 months before the client is handed off. So I'd love your perspective on what you're hearing from the client's side on why this is such an important endeavor.
So I actually have spoken with someone very recently who there's an organization, I can't recall the name of it, but it's sort of an association of general counsels of a bunch of large corporations. And I asked this individual, I said, is succession planning something that is kind of on the radar for, general counsels at these larger corporations that are obviously have huge legal spend budgets and are hiring law firms all over the country for all number of different things. And the response is yes, they are very much aware of this. They have seen it in the past from the client perspective, especially a larger client, these larger corporations. They've seen it in the past well within their purview to say to a law firm, you need to have X number of $1 million of professional liability insurance. And if you don't have the insurance policy in place, you can't work for us. You need to have certain cybersecurity, guardrails in place. And if you don't have these particular, password protected, I'm not a tech guy, obviously, but there's usually, and I've actually heard from people on the cybersecurity end that clients used to kind of give them like a one sheet page, and now it's many pages long. Our law firm is bringing the head of IT in to check off the boxes to make sure they really are meeting the standards that these clients are demanding of them when it comes to cybersecurity. So they've seen it sort of within their rights to demand that their firms, or I guess gently ask, that their firms have a lot of these things in place. And they are now really kind of aware of succession planning. And I think you're probably going to start to see more larger clients mandating or asking their law firms to either provide a copy of or somehow check boxes off that they do have a succession plan in place. And then it's not, the bare minimum, that it meets certain requirements, because again, they read the news as well. And you and I are talking about law firms that have, folded or are running into problems because they did a succession plan. And the last thing a client wants, especially a large corporate client with, many, many millions of dollars online, the last thing they want to do is find out a law firm they liked and trusted and they thought was doing a great job on their cases is doing a good job on their cases, but just didn't really figure out how they're going to figure out the next generation thing. And the partner they liked or the attorney they liked is now going to another firm, and they'll probably keep the case with that attorney. They'll probably transition to the firm, but it'll leave a bit of a taste in their mouth that they were not really, they entrusted their work to a firm that didn't take the time to, or the energy to really make sure that they were on solid footing for the next 10, 15, 20 years.
I think you've hit the nail on the head, because in my experience, I have seen that when the clients start to focus on those conversations, the law firms are forced to. Oftentimes, particularly during my time in-house, if a certain topic or question, as you mentioned, cybersecurity and some others, started to become more consistent in the RFP process for some of our major clients, it's something that the firm knew it had to pay attention to if it wasn't already. So I think you're spot on with that. Patrick, before we go, I just want to find out if you have any questions for me.
There might be a bit of somewhat of a nexus between public relations and succession planning. I think we've all seen how it's a bit of a public relations nightmare when those things don't go well. And I wonder, do you think there's any value or any benefit for a law firm to maybe have some sort of public relations initiative behind either succession planning or just being aware, or maybe making it more of a publicly known event when a senior partner retires and a junior partner steps into his or her shoes? That's something that you foresee having a public relations component to it?
I think the biggest benefit is internal communications in that regard. And I think it's a couple-fold. It's client acquisition, right? Really over communicating what the plan is and how it benefits the client and what they can expect in that process. We mentioned before transparency, and we preach that to our clients endlessly. It's also, so externally, I think it's a talent acquisition and retention tool. If, as you mentioned earlier, if there are younger or more junior attorneys who really enjoy the firm and want to see themselves having a future there, it's really important to communicate that internally, that there is opportunity to be part of a long-term plan, to look forward to a greater role on a client account team, but also externally to communicate, as you said, to the public. That would start, in my opinion, to help attract talent that may be in a situation where they don't see longevity or they don't see that there's a path or a future there. So I think public relations and communications does play a big role in this. And I think we'll see this kind of bubble up over the next couple of years as firms start to hopefully focus on this more in a really meaningful way and go through a formal process.
I do. And I do think the future in this area, I think, is, a bit of a wake-up call lately with law firms. And I think, they take these things seriously. They can see the writing on the wall. And to the extent that they don't have a formal or a solid succession plan in place, I do see more and more law firms getting on board, calling someone up and say, hey, I need some help here. Let's get something figured out, because we have a great firm. We have some great attorneys. We love our clients. We don't want this party to end. So let's figure out a way to just keep things going, So I hope to get more and more of those calls in the future. I think it's an area that should be taken seriously. And I think lately a lot of law firms are starting to really, put an eye to this, which is fantastic.
Well, Patrick, you're a wealth of information in this area. I could go on and on talking to you. We try to keep these podcast episodes to a certain time so that our listeners will stay until the very end. But I would like to ask you, if someone would like to get in touch with you and learn more about you, the services you offer, your experience in succession planning, where can they get in touch?
The best way is go to our website, which is armanino.com. And if you scroll down, you can see a section there where you can, search by industry. Just click on law firms, and you'll see my name, my contact information, and we're happy to, have a call with any law firm to talk about their issues and figure out if this is something that they need to drill down a little bit more on, and we can talk to them about, a proposal or trying to work together. But I'm always happy to talk to lawyers and law firms. In fact, I love talking to lawyers and law firms about any issues they might be having, and see if there's any advice I can give or anything we do to, help them out with whatever might be, whatever pain point they might be dealing with.
Well, you might want to be careful because you might get people like me who really nerd out on these topics and may just want to chat more with you.
For 15 years, I worked at law firms, and I would always go to the holiday party with a bunch of lawyers, and I bring my wife, and she's like, "Oh my God, it's full of attorneys." And I said, "I know, isn't it great?" So I
That's why we get along so well. That's exactly how I am at holiday parties too. So I will ensure that the contact information that you just shared, the way to get in touch with you, is linked in our show notes. So it's really easily accessible for our listeners. I have enjoyed our conversation.
I have thoroughly enjoyed this.
Yes. Thank you so much for joining me. And thank you so much to our listeners, and have a great day.
Thank you very much. Thanks for having me.
Thank you for listening to On Record PR. Visit our website, onrecordpr.com, to subscribe to the show, share it with your friends on social media, find show notes, additional episodes, and more information. We'll see you next time. In the meantime, feel free to send us questions or show ideas at podcast@onrecordpr.com.